Greetings, everyone, and welcome to God Save the King. I am your host, Tim Keyes. I want to thank you for joining me on the Truth Be Told radio network, where you can hear my show every Friday night at 10 p.m. Eastern Time. Now, as my manner is, I'm very excited about today's show. I'm pretty much always excited about today's show. Today, as I was doing my show prep, I had an idea that I was, convinced that this is where I was going to go. We were going to talk about God Save the King today. Now, this show is God Save the King. It's always my show. It's always God Save the King. But for those of you that are familiar with my show, and for those of you that maybe aren't so familiar with my show, what God Save the King is all about is God Save the King is all about the nativity of Jesus of Nazareth and how the traditional nativity story has kind of taken on a life of its own, and it's really not that biblically or historically accurate. And what I have endeavored to do is I want to retell the nativity story in its biblical, historical, scientific, archaeological, and astronomical accuracy. I want to tell the story the way it really would have looked. And that means that frequently what I do is that I dive very deep into the history of what was going on at that time, and therefore we can put the story against the backdrop of the history that was going on at the time. And it surprisingly changes the story. It certainly changes our perspective. It gives it a different look. It's just not this quaint little story about Joseph and Mary on the back of a donkey and traveling to Bethlehem because of a Roman taxation, which is really weird. I won't get into it, right now, but that is what God Save the King is primarily about. And I was very excited to share information about a character in the historical narrative that we haven't really talked about yet. Well, that's going to have to wait. Really sorry. That's going to have to wait, because as I was doing the show prep, a certain subject just kind of took over, right? I started working on it, and the inspiration just started coming, and it just kept coming, and it just kept coming, and it just kept coming. And it was like, well, okay, I guess that's what I've got to talk about today, is where the inspiration was leading me. And it's related to some areas that we have already talked about. If you are familiar with my show, if you've gone and seen the past episodes on Rumble or on my YouTube page, anything like that, watched any of the archived issues, you know that we have talked about the Nativity. We've talked about God Save the King. We've talked about the prophetic process. We've talked about identity. We certainly talked about the everlasting covenant at length. We've talked about God's eternal purpose and ultimate intention. We've talked about context. Okay. When you're studying the Bible, the singular most important interpretive issue is context. And then lately we've been talking about religion versus relationship. I've done several shows, several parts to a series that I've called The Reversal of Adam. You've heard me mention genealogies from time to time, and we're going to get into something. What's going on today, excuse me, is what we're going to talk about tonight. It's involved in every one of these things. It's a piece of the puzzle in every single one of these issues. Boils back down to this, because this is a very core issue. It's a very, very core issue. And if you were going to put a title on tonight's show, I had to do this when I opened up, the software in order to record the show. I got to give it a title, right? Well, the title I gave it is Genesis Myth? Is Genesis myth? And that's what we're going to talk about tonight. Is we are going to talk about is Genesis mythology, or is Genesis history? And to give you a very Hebraic answer to that, the answer is yes. Okay, the answer is yes. And we're going to get into that in a minute, but let's take a second. You know how this works. This is social media. So let's take just a moment and let's talk about how you can take advantage of God Save the King on the Truth Be Told radio network. If you prefer a video format, our recommended platform is Rumble. So you can go see God Save the King on Rumble. You can also see it. I have a YouTube page as well. Truth Be Told Network also has a YouTube page, but our preferred platform is Rumble. Now, if you prefer a podcast format, then simply go to the Truth Be Told Radio Network website, which is www.truthbetoldnetwork.org. Click on the podcast tab, and then that will take you to the icons for the major podcast platforms where you can see or listen to, frankly, because it is a video podcast, where you can share in God Save the King and all of the great shows that are on the Truth Be Told Radio Network. And then finally, if you prefer a strict, audio format, if you want to be able to listen to this driving your car on your smartphone or something like that, simply go to truthbetoldnetwork.org and click on the Listen Live button, and you will be able to take part in the show that way. So that is how you can help us help you. Of course, make sure to like, subscribe, follow, all that stuff. That helps the algorithms, and therefore it supports us on our shows and our ability to keep these shows coming. So if you enjoy content like this, please help us out by liking, following, and subscribing so that we can keep doing this. Okay, so let's talk about this. This is really interesting. Is Genesis mythology? And I jokingly said, well, the proper Hebraic answer to that question would be yes. But yes, what is it? Is it myth or is it history? And the answer is yes. It is myth and it is history. Now, what it's not, okay, and I mentioned this in our last episode, is what it is not. What I'm not saying is I am not saying that Genesis is myth in the sense of saying that Genesis is false, that it's falsehood, because that's the modern definition of the word myth. Is it's a falsehood, right? The myth of this, the myth of that, right? And it means something is false. That is not the classical definition of myth. The classical definition of myth is different, and we need to pay attention to the classical definition of myth. The classical definition of myth, it is an ancient, non-fictional, sacred, traditional narrative that establishes the foundation and identity of the culture or nation that embraces it. But it is told in poetic, primordial language. There you go. So let me read that again. For those of you that are who are on audio only, myth is the classical definition of myth is that myth is an ancient, non-fictional, sacred, traditional narrative that establishes the foundation and identity of the culture or nation that embraces it, but told in poetic, primordial language. There you go. So if you think about Arthurian legend in England, there you go. That is an ancient, non-fictional. So that's where it gets kind of interesting here, is because if you try to go back and figure out exactly who King Arthur was, it's tough. It's tough, right? You get people who say he's real. You get people who say he's completely fictional, but most of the time it is, no, wait a second. This is based on a real dude. We may not know exactly who that is, but this is based on a real person and on real historical events. See, so a mythological narrative, it's nonfiction. It's just that it's poetic, primordial language. Poetic, primordial language. Same is true of Mesopotamian creation stories. Same is true of Roman and Greek myth. In Greek mythology, the Battle of Troy plays this huge central role in Greek mythology. But when and where exactly was the Battle of Troy, right? There is archaeological evidence that suggests certain things, but just like the Arthurian legends, everybody's like, okay, we can't like prove it, but it's not that we don't have evidence. We do have evidence that suggests that once again, it was a real event. It was a legitimate historical event that happened, but the story now is told in this primordial poetic language. Well, the same is true for the Bible, but there are also some key differences. The key distinction with the Bible is its claim of inspiration. That is what sets the Bible apart from all of these other myths, is the claim of inspiration, that it is divinely inspired, that God spoke, and that human writers wrote, what God told them to write down, and then recorded these ancient, non-fictional, sacred, there you go, sacred historical narratives that establish the foundation and identity of the culture or nation that embraces it. So in our case, in what we're talking about here, this is the Judeo-Christian culture. It's the nation of Israel, right? And then notice in the definition here, let me put it back up. Let me put that back up. Let me take a second and get back there. Here we go. Myth is an ancient, non-fictional, sacred, traditional narrative that establishes the foundation and identity of the culture or nation that embraces it, but told in poetic primordial language. So what we're going to see today, what we're going to talk about today, is how the nation of Israel fits into this definition. And then how does Christianity fit into this definition? Because I'm not an ethnic Jew. Okay, but I believe this is true about the Bible, that it establishes the foundation and identity of the nation of Israel, and therefore the culture that embraces that, which that would be me, right? That would be me. I'm a Gentile who acknowledges, ready? This in the wrong circles, this could be inflammatory language, but I follow an ethnic Messiah. He's Jewish. He always will be Jewish, because remember, we have a human being sitting on the right hand of God. Jesus of Nazareth became a man and is going to remain a man for all eternity, and yet he sits on the throne of God, and he is an ethnic human being. He is Jewish by race. Okay, the nation of Israel is God's chosen people, which, that is inflammatory language as well. And lots of people, don't want to believe that. Okay, and challenge that. And man, there is just anti-Semitism going crazy around the world right now, which is not surprising, because the Bible says that is what's going to happen. Now, that is not what I really want to talk about. What I do want to talk about, however, once again, is this sacred traditional narrative, this ancient, non-fictional, sacred traditional narrative, because we find this in the book of Genesis. We find this, we find it all over, but we really find it in the book of Genesis, and we really find it in the earlier chapters of the book of Genesis. And yet at the same time, like I said earlier, what sets the Bible apart and what sets the Judeo-Christian narrative apart is the claim of inspiration. All scripture is given by inspiration of God. Theopneustos, right? All scripture is given by inspiration of God and is profitable for doctrine, for reproof, for correction, for instruction in righteousness. We believe, Jews and Christians believe, that the Bible is quote unquote God breathed. That it wasn't so much dictation, that's not really the right way to describe how that inspiration worked, but he inspired human scribes to write down what he told them to write down. But it's not really taking dictation necessarily. They clearly did use other, for lack of a better word, sources, right? Moses clearly did, Paul clearly did, that they read other documents of the time and even used them in bits and pieces. But then ultimately it was this inspiration that led them to write what they wrote. So what I want to go after today, what I want you to track with me on here, is I want to talk about some patterns that are in the early chapters of Genesis. And that's because these patterns are there for a reason. Because if you were to encounter one pattern like this in an ancient story, that wouldn't really be all that stunning. But if you were to encounter another pattern laid on top of that first pattern, then you'd start to go, wow, what's up with that? Right? And then if you were to find pattern on top of pattern on top of pattern, then things start to get really interesting, because how is it possible for someone to write a story with these layers, and the layers always work out? The best metaphor we have, or the best illustration we have, is certainly you could do this with what is it? Oh, good Lord. Can't believe I'm blanking when I'm on air here. The software that you use to modify pictures. God darn it. I keep wanting to say PowerPoint, and it's not PowerPoint. It's not what I'm talking about. I'm thinking of PowerPoint because PowerPoint is slides, right? Anyway, when I was a kid in school, right, we used to have, and I mean a child, I mean, grade school, elementary school, right? Maybe into junior high school. We had these things called transparencies, and he had this funky transparency projector that would allow the teacher to, take this thing and put it up on the wall, right? And then you'd have these clear plastic sheets, these transparencies that they could write on or draw on, or maybe they came pre-printed with certain information on them. And then they would put these on this projector and put them up on the wall. Well, sometimes they were multi-layered. So you'd put down one and you saw this partial picture, and then they'd add another one and the picture got more complete, and then you'd add another and the picture got more complete, and then you'd get another, and finally the picture would be entirely complete and you could see the whole thing. That's what you've got going on in the early chapters of Genesis. I mean, it's really throughout the entire Bible. You've got it everywhere in the Bible, but you've got some very conspicuous patterns in the Bible, especially in Genesis, that help us go, oh, really? Wow, I never knew that. And then when you see these patterns laid on top of patterns, right? So here's what I'm talking about. Let's get into it. So there are multiple times in Scripture where God makes a covenant with humanity, right? And then he singles out an individual that is the mediator of the covenant. He's the person that God speaks with, even though that person is representing either the entire human race or a portion of the human race. So the first time that happens is in Genesis chapter 2, where God is making a covenant with Adam and Eve, and it is, and in academic circles we call that the Edenic covenant. Okay, this is the one that's commonly referred to when people talk about the dominion mandate. Here, let me get it up on the screen. This will help out. Let me screen share. We'll get this up on the screen so we can talk about it together. So if you look at this, let me get my cursor over there too, by the way. Let me go here and doot. Where'd it go? Is it? Yeah, it's got to be that one. Okay. Well, can I? All right. So if you look at the second one down, it says the Edenic covenant, right? Talks about the Edenic covenant. This was a covenant made between God and Adam and Eve, and it was the terms of the covenant. Okay, all right, let's back up. Sorry, ladies and gentlemen, kind of fumbling this a little bit, but remember what I'm trying to do here is I want you to see pattern. I want you to see the pattern that's in the early chapters of Genesis. And like I said, you've got multiple overlapping patterns. That's what makes this so significant. So pattern number one we need to talk about for just a second is the fact that covenants always have three fundamental components. There's always the terms of the covenant, then the blood of the covenant, and then the seal of the covenant. Okay? So the terms are just that. They're the terms of the covenant. They're what each party agrees to. Then the blood of the covenant is usually a sacrificial animal, although not always. As you'll see, as you're about to see here, there's blood involved. There's the shedding of blood, and then there's a seal. There's some type of token or seal that reminds the parties of the covenant. Okay. See, so there's pattern number one: terms, blood, seal. The terms of the covenant, the blood of the covenant, and then the seal of the covenant. Okay. Then what you're going to see is we're going to go through this list in chronological order, and what you're going to see is that the covenant gets cut, or the covenant gets instituted, the covenant begins, and then there is some form of failure, for lack of a better word, some kind of failure, and then there's a renewal, and a new covenant gets cut, a new covenant gets made, right? And I've included the everlasting covenant because that is a covenant made by the members of the Godhead in eternity past that they implemented, and then it had this, for lack of a better word, had this failure, right? And then they renewed it. Then came the Edenic covenant. The Edenic covenant was declared in Genesis chapter 1, okay? It's the creation account, but it's laid out in covenant language. And then ironically, the failure of that covenant, okay, occurred in Genesis chapter 3, right? When Adam and Eve ate of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So they were told, see, it was the dominion mandate, right, which was in Genesis 1:26, and told them basically to go make the whole earth like Eden, right? That was what God told Adam and Eve to do. Go make the whole earth like Eden. But what you don't do is you don't eat of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And that is what happened in Genesis 3 in verse 6. So there was a kind of failure. But interestingly enough, then that was followed by a renewal. Okay. As I've talked about in shows in the past, God did not come to find Adam and Eve. He didn't go looking for them to punish them. He went looking for them to renew his relationship with them. And that's what we see in Genesis chapter 3, verses 14 through 23, is God is renewing his covenant with humanity. See, so the very first covenant is the everlasting covenant. It was made in the councils of the Godhead before creation, before Genesis 1:1. And I've done other shows on that you can review that give you all the details of the everlasting covenant. But it talks about, a kingdom prepared before the foundation of the world. And, that's from Matthew 25. And then in Ephesians chapter 1, It talks about how we should be holy and blameless before him in love because he chose us from before the foundation of the world. In Timothy, 2 Timothy chapter 1, it talks about how we are called with a holy calling that he gave us in Christ before the ages began. See, and then the blood of the covenant is the lamb slain from the foundation of the world. That's Genesis 3:8. See, so that's not a covenant made with humanity. That's a covenant made within the members of the Godhead. But that all takes place before creation. But you can see the terms of the covenant, the blood of the covenant, and then the seal of the covenant. And then you can see the beginning of this pattern that there is the declaration or initiation of the covenant. And then there's this kind of failure, for lack of a better term. And then there's a renewal of the covenant. Okay. So the failure, okay, check this out, is what we see in Genesis 1:2, where it says the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. Now, what I am not doing here is I am not confirming or denying all the different theories about like a pre-Adamic race or a gap theory or any of that kind of stuff. But I believe that this is here for a reason. And remember how we started this out. We are talking about myth, okay? We are talking about an ancient, traditional, sacred story told in primordial, poetic language. So that's why it includes this phraseology about the earth being without form and void. See? Because then God has to renew and recreate the earth, right? And that's what Genesis 1 is all about. So you can see this pattern starting even when there's no other actor except God. No other actor except God. Now, I realize the word failure there is a very loaded term, and God did not fail. But I believe that this language is there to help us see this pattern, that this is this pattern of covenant, failure, renewal. Covenant, failure, renewal. Covenant, failure, renewal. So if you start with the everlasting covenant, before Genesis 1:1, before creation, and then you see Genesis 1:2, the earth is without form and void, and then that means beginning in Genesis 1:3, all the way through Genesis 2:25, you see the recreation of the earth and the establishment of what is called the Edenic covenant, sometimes called the dominion mandate, where Adam and Eve are told by God to make the world like Eden. Okay, there we go. But what happens? But they fail. Okay, so that failure comes in Genesis 3:6, where they eat of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And then, like I said, God comes looking for them, but he doesn't come looking for them to punish them. He comes looking for them to restore and to renew and to bless. See, and I should mention this, I forgot to mention it earlier. Let's make sure we get it in there now. The everlasting covenant is a declaration of God's eternal purpose and ultimate intention. And his eternal purpose and ultimate intention, sealed by a covenant, was for the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit to expand the fellowship of the Godhead by creating their Ezer Kenegdo, their perfect partner, their perfect counterpart, their perfect companion. Okay, so that was God's declared eternal purpose and ultimate intention, sealed in a covenant, that I will create my perfect companion, my perfect partner, and that is going to be the human race, right? And then you've got these wonderful binaries, absolutely deliberate by God, These wonderful binary pairs of that God is invisible, man is visible. God is celestial, man is terrestrial, right? And then I can keep going, keep going, keep going. And then you see the binary pairs all through Genesis chapter 1, where God creates the heavens and the earth, binary pair. He creates the dry land and the waters. And there's more than one kind of water, right? And he separates the earth from the water, right? Binary pair, right? And then he keeps going. And then the ultimate binary pair, of course, is male and female. And then when God creates Eve for Adam, part of what he is doing is he is modeling what he is actually doing for himself. So once again, this is all part of the myth. It's all a part of the ancient, traditional, sacred narrative, non-fictional narrative that establishes the foundation and identity of the people who choose to follow it. So this is, as followers of Christ, this is our foundation. This is our foundation, right? But once again, it's written in poetic, primordial language. It's not, quote unquote, literal. It's not a historical narrative the way we're used to reading historical narratives now about the Civil War or something, right? This poetic, primordial language. And the book of Genesis is like this, especially in the beginning. Now, that we're going to talk about this a little bit later, that starts to change. See, earlier in the book, you have the much more poetic language. And then as the book progresses, the language starts to shift. And the language does shift to more of a traditional historical narrative like we would be used to. But in the early chapters in particular, it's this poetic primordial language. That does not mean it's fiction. It's nonfiction. It's true. It's a historical narrative. It's just that it is a poetic historical narrative. Just and humanity, we've been doing this for millennia, right? That we have been writing these poetic, primordial, historical narratives to explain our origins. So from that point of view, the Bible is very similar to the other creation myths and things like that. See, and now I'm using the word myth. It's the same way. I don't automatically mean that the others are fiction, not automatically. But the distinction is not between fiction and nonfiction. The distinction is between inspired and not inspired. That's what sets the Bible apart, is inspiration. Okay? Holy men of God spoke as they were moved by the Spirit of God and wrote it down, right? So now let's see if I can get back to this screen here. Give me one sec. And get this covenant pattern back up here. So like I said, we start with the everlasting covenant, then we move to the Edenic covenant. But then the Edenic covenant, quote unquote, fails in Genesis chapter 3, verse 6, right? Well, then when God comes looking for Adam and Eve, he doesn't come looking for them to punish them. He comes looking for them to reestablish the covenant and bless them. See, so going back to the everlasting covenant for a moment, God's eternal purpose and ultimate intention was to create his Ezer Kenegdo, to create his perfect counterpart, and then to live with that perfect counterpart for eternity. That is God's plan, right? So he creates Adam and Eve. He gets them in on the plan and says, make the rest of the world Eden, right? Well, they failed. They made a mistake, right? So God comes and he reestablishes. Now, take note about kind of how that looked, right? Because we are told that Adam and Eve were created in the image of God, and we are told that they had an intimate fellowship with the presence of God, that when they hid, it says explicitly that they hid from the presence of God. And I've explained in other episodes that I absolutely believe that this was an internal change inside Adam and Eve, that those who were designed, created to be in the presence of God, that when they sinned, okay, and that's a very loaded term that we frequently do not understand, being in the presence of God became unbearable, which is why they hid. That's why they hid from God, is because being in his presence became unbearable. And we read that they made coverings for themselves. They made them out of fig leaves, which is a symbol of religion. They tried to solve the problem themselves, but then God steps in and he makes coverings for them made from animal skin. So implying shed blood. And in poetic language, see, and once again, poetic primordial language, it has to be a lamb. It has to be a lamb that was slain. Okay, it couldn't have been anything else, right? But God sheds blood in this prototype, right? In this prototype that's going to eventually lead us to the antitype. Now, prototype and antitype, by the way, that's pattern again. That's pattern. See, and you can't get away from this in the book of Genesis. There's pattern everywhere, right? So now when God comes to Adam and Eve and he sets out to fix things, what does he do? Well, he renews the covenant. He renews the covenant. So this one in scholastic circles is called the Adamic covenant. Okay, now the Adamic covenant, and here you go, you got terms, and then you got blood, and you got seal, right? So take note that in the everlasting covenant, the blood is the blood of the lamb shed from the foundation of the world, right? In the Edenic covenant, the blood shed is the blood from Adam's side when God opens him up to create Eve. Now, was that literal or poetic? Okay. Once again, the answer is yes, right? Remember, this is poetic primordial language. Was it literal? Maybe, maybe not. It's poetic primordial language, right? Now, when you get to the Adamic covenant, Genesis 3:14 through 23, the blood of the covenant is the blood of the lamb that God slayed in order to make coverings for Adam and Eve, right? And yes, they're put out of the garden, but where were they always supposed to go? They were supposed to make the rest of the world like Eden. Okay, you can make an argument that didn't really change, that's what they were, is that, okay, you didn't do it right the first time, Adam, Eve. Okay, so guess what I'm going to do? I'm going to put you out of the garden. Now go make the rest of the world like Eden. Okay, we don't know that provision changed. Okay, we don't know that provision changed. So now what are Adam and Eve supposed to do? They're supposed to go out into the world, right? And then back to this in a future episode. I've been doing a bunch of episodes on the on reversing Adam, right? Saying the problems that came with the fall of humanity. And the Genesis chapter 4 is just loaded with this stuff. I mean, talk about a mythological chapter. I mean, they all are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I mean, they're just loaded with this rich mythological, poetic, primordial language that is nonfiction, but it's also non-literal. Okay. Yes, I keep hammering this. It's important. It's also nonfiction. It's non-literal, but it's also non-fiction. It is truth. It is the foundational story. It's the ancient, traditional, foundational narrative that establishes our foundation and our of who we are as God's creation, as followers of Jesus of Nazareth. right? It establishes our foundation. So now Adam and Eve are out of the garden, right? So if Adam and Eve are out of the garden and they're supposed to go make the world like Eden, and they've also got she's got this promise how her seed is going to bruise the head of the serpent, right? And she misinterprets this right out of the gate, right? Genesis 4, she misinterprets it right out of the gate. But then also apparently her descendants misinterpret this in Genesis 6. Because Genesis is the story of the Watchers, okay, who left their first estate, came the sons of Elohim, and they came in unto children by them, created the entire human. Okay, so now the human race can't bring forth the Messiah from the human gene pool if the human gene pool is contaminated, right? Plus, they taught humanity all kinds of just perverse things that humanity was not supposed to know, but now they do, right? And it corrupted humanity severely, right? And that's why in Genesis chapter 6, pretty sure it's either verse 9 or verse 14, I don't have it in front of me, where we are told that Noah was genetically uncontaminated. He was perfect in his generations, it says. He was genetically uncontaminated by the DNA of the Watchers, or the DNA of the Nephilim, right? The Nephilim are the offspring of the Watchers and human women, right? But the point being here is that you got the everlasting covenant. You have this kind of odd form of failure with the earth being without form and void. Then God renews it, Genesis chapter 1 and 2, right, which establishes the Edenic covenant with Adam and Eve. But then they fail in Genesis 3:6. Then God reestablishes the covenant in Genesis 3:14 through 23, which then they fail in Genesis chapters 6 through 9. But then and God destroys the earth with a flood. We know that that's the flood story. But then when Noah exits the ark, okay, when Noah exits the ark, what does God do? God renews the covenant. Okay. See, so I am hoping this is helping you see the big picture here, that there really is an umbrella going on, that you have God's, like I said, you have his eternal purpose and ultimate intention declared in the everlasting covenant, and then he is going to implement it on earth. Well, humanity is supposed to play along, but we keep messing up. But God is faithful, so that each time we mess up, yeah, he goes in and he's got to scrub things clean, okay? He's got to scrub things clean, but he doesn't give up, right? He doesn't give up. He reinstates the covenant with Adam and Eve. Now he's reinstating the covenant with Noah. Same thing. And this, you find this in Genesis chapter 9 in verses 1 through 17. God is talking all about the covenant that he is going to establish with Noah. Capital punishment is in there, which is very interesting, by the way. There's the shed blood of the animal sacrifices. And then there's the seal of the covenant, which is the rainbow, where God says, I'm never going to destroy the earth by water again, right? But then it happens again. What happens is, if you fast forward a couple of more chapters, you get to Genesis chapter 11. And let's do this. Let me just go there and let me read this to you, okay? So Genesis chapter 11, rather. Genesis chapter 11, verses 1 through 9 reads, Now the whole earth had one language and the same words. And as people migrated from the east, they found a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. And they said to one another, come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly. And they had brick for stone and bitumen for mortar. Then they said, come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens, and let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be dispersed over the face of the whole earth. And the Lord came down to see the city and the tower which the children of man had built. And the Lord said, behold, they are one people, and they have one language, and this is only the beginning of what they will do, and nothing that they propose to do will now be impossible for them. Here we go. Come, let us go down and there confuse their language so that they may not understand one another's speech. So the Lord dispersed them from there over the face of the earth, and they left off building the city. Therefore, its name was called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language over all the earth, and from there the Lord dispersed them over the face of all the earth. So the point being is that humanity, once again, remember how I talked about that the foundation of religion is this notion that God is out there and that we are down here and that we've got to do something to reach God. Well, here it is, right? At Babel, they're going to build a city, they're going to build a tower, they're going to reach to God, but it's all in their own power, it's all in their own strength, it's all according to their own understanding. So it's not what God wants. It's not according to his plan. So what you've got here is pretty much a straight up rebellion of the human race against God. So what does God do? I'm not going to stand for this. I'm going to confuse their language, and I'm going to scatter them over the face of the earth. Now, this is very important. You've got to make sure that you include Deuteronomy chapter 32 in your understanding of this, because you'll notice it says, God said, let us go down and there confuse their language. Ironically, he's not speaking as the Godhead. He's speaking of the Elohim. He's speaking of the counsel of God, the Elohim, right? And so a parallel record is in Deuteronomy chapter 32, but there is a translational error in Deuteronomy 32 that has prohibited us from really understanding this properly, okay? So, for example, if I read Deuteronomy 32:8 from the New King James, this is how it reads. It reads, when the Most High divided their inheritance to the nations, when he separated the sons of Adam, he set the boundaries of people according to the number of the children of Israel. Now, when you read this record in context, it is clear that these verses are talking about the incident in Genesis 11, okay? When the Most High divided their inheritance to the nations, right? When he separated the sons of Adam and set their boundaries of the peoples, right? This is talking about the scattering of the people across the earth. But notice that he says in the New King James Version that it reads according to the number of the children of Israel. The number of the children of Israel didn't exist at Babel. Israel did not exist. The man, Jacob, who was renamed Israel, did not exist at that time. The nation of Israel did not exist at this time. This has been mistranslated. It's been deliberately mistranslated because people don't like what it implies. Because now let me read it from the ESV. The ESV gets it right. And I'm going to start in verse 7 and then continue through verse 9. So Deuteronomy 32, 7 through 9 from the ESV reads, remember the days of old, consider the years of many generations, ask your father and he will show you, your elders and they will tell you. When the Most High gave to the nations their inheritance, when he divided mankind, he fixed the borders of the people according to the sons of God. Okay, that in Hebrew, that's Benai Elohim. It's the same phrase as sons of God back in Genesis 6. God fixed the borders of the people according to the Benai Elohim, the sons of God. So in other words, these Elohim they're the minor gods that were in charge of these nations. We read about this in Daniel, where we read about the prince of Persia, right? See, that's what this is. This is a divine council, right? That are the lesser gods over these nations, right? So this is what happened at Babel, is God divided the people, he spread them over the face of the earth, and he distributed them according to the Benai Elohim, according to the sons of God, so that they would be the minor deities in this area. But now look at verse 9. But the Lord's portion is his people, Jacob his allotted inheritance. So even though he divided the nations among the Benai Elohim at Babel, he reserved a portion for himself, right? So the Benai Elohim, the divine council, these minor deities become the gods of these other nations, but God Most High, right? Yahweh, Elohim, God Most High, who there is none other like him, he prophetically reserved a portion to himself. See, and that's in Genesis 11, the first half of the chapter. And then what do we get as the second half of the chapter? The second half of the chapter is a genealogy and then the beginning of the story of Abraham. And see, and that makes complete sense, because if you go back to the chart here that I've got posted up here for you to read along, right, you can see the progression, right? And really this is what I'm driving at. What I've been trying to help you see is that you've got a very clear pattern. You've got covenant after covenant after covenant after covenant. And what covenant does is covenant defines relationship. That's what covenant does. Covenant defines relationship. And the everlasting covenant defined the relationship between the members of the Godhead and their creation. So in a fashion, after a fashion, it is a covenant between God and humanity. Even though humanity didn't exist yet, it is a record of the council of the Godhead, the eternal council of the Godhead, deciding to create, right? So in a prophetic sense, it's a covenant between God and humanity. But then something goes wrong, right? You've got this earth without form and void. And like I said, I am not confirming or denying at this time any of the theories about pre-Adamic race or gap theory or something like that. But it does seem that something happened, that there's something in this spot, and that this poetic language is there for a reason, which is why Genesis 1 reads like both a creation and a recreation. But clearly, he establishes a covenant with Adam at that time, the Edenic covenant. Go forth and make the rest of the world like Eden. But then Adam and Eve fail at that. Then when God goes to them and goes looking for them, it's not to punish, it's to reestablish. So you reestablish the Adamic covenant, right? The shed blood from the lamb that was slain to make coverings for Adam and Eve. But then they're put out of the garden to go make the earth like Eden. Okay, well, in apparently a botched understanding of the seed of the woman, you've got the combined rebellion, for lack of a better word, of the Benai Elohim and the daughters of men in Genesis 6, produces this mutant offspring race, the Nephilim. That messes things up really bad. The human race learns things that they're not supposed to know, et cetera, et cetera. And then initiated by that, and then fast forwarding however many generations, you get to Genesis 11, where now you have a full-on rebellion of the human race against God at Babel. So God disperses them over the earth. That's his solution. And then here you go. He starts again. And he starts again with Abraham and the Abrahamic covenant that he is going to use to demonstrate to the world that he is still God, that he is most high, that his plan is still absolutely ready to go and is going to work, and that he will see it through. So we've completely run out of time, so I've got to stop right there. Ladies and gentlemen, I really want to thank you for joining me on God Save the King on the Truth Be Told Radio Network. We will continue this the next time we are together. God save the King.